Okay, should say that it's live. John, nice to see you
Oliver,
again.
nice to see you.
And welcome to everybody in the room.
Your faithful fans.
Oh, your faithful, all 700 of them.
fans.
All 700 of them.
Right,
so we're streaming. If you guys are watching at home, the idea is that we're streaming this live on Facebook in the book club group. I'm going to have it on my laptop here. So if you are watching it, I want you to put a comment or put a hello, just so that before we even get started, we know that it's working. And then I'll see if I can find it here, and then we get started, right?
Sure.
There's a comment, has the John Baxter interview started? That means that's either a good sign or a bad sign. Hang on. And then we get started with the questions. There you go, live, play. Excellent. There you go, there we are.
There we are.
Okay, so now I can see if the comments are coming through. I can see that people are watching. And there you go. Brilliant. So you guys at home, put your comments, put your likes. I want to see it before we get started on the conversation. And then, great. Claudine Hemingway says, hi, John.
Oh, hi, Claudine.
So we're going to talk to everybody in the room and the people on here, do a little bit of a mix. I see people watching. This is great. And we're going to be talking about a year in Paris, which I see there's one by Katie's feet that we can have,
there you go.
just in case anybody at home doesn't know what we're talking about. A Year in Paris. It's been the book club book for the whole month. Everyone watching here and online has read it, and so now we can talk about it.
Yeah. I'm sure this is why it's gone into 3 printings in that month.
That deserves another cheer, I think. So just as a refresher, this book has been out for what, 3 weeks, a month?
Yeah, yeah.
And it's already on its third
printing.
So what does that actually mean?
It means, you know, like 20-some thousand copies around, where usually it would be 5.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
5,000 or 5?
No, 5,000. 5,000. Come on.
That's a brilliant start.
I'm very happy.
Congratulations.
Yes. HarperCollins are even happier.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Worth celebrating with champagne, rosé, and all the other drinks that we have.
Lots of Bordeaux.
Fantastic. So I figure we're going to talk about the books, the book, and the people watching at home are going to be sending in questions, and then we're going to do a question and answer session. But people are watching from all over the world: California, Illinois, Australia. Fantastic. But first things first, the book. The book. It was absolutely a wonderful read.
That's just because you're in it.
That's something we're going to touch on a little bit later as well. But what's been the response to it? Besides the fact, obviously.
Tremendous response even before publication from the trade press, which is really important because that's what the booksellers read, and they order in based on those reviews, and every review was great. And subsequently, of course, there are fewer and fewer places that do reviews, but on Amazon and so on like that, very good response. So no, I'm very happy because it's not an easy book. It's not as easy as The Most Beautiful Walk in the World and those. It's got a bit of history in it. It's got some autobiography. It's got some, for want of a better word, philosophy. It's a bit more complicated, but I think maybe people like that.
Well, what is it that makes, like, so your other books haven't been as research heavy? Is that what you...
They're more personal. You know, they're books about me living in Paris, me eating things in Paris, me, you know, walking around in Paris. But this is a bit more about Paris in the present day, but also as it was 200 years ago during the Revolution, because the Revolution all took place right around here. Actually, it turns out the Marquis de Sade was born right here. Wow. On this piece of ground.
Hasn't this piece of ground got, in fact, this whole street just like riddled with history?
Of course, this was the first street to have a sidewalk in Paris.
Really?
Yes. And all the people I write about in this, Danton, Fabre d'Églantine, Camille Desmoulins, and people like that, they all lived around here. They would have been my neighbours.
But is that what drew you to the area, or was it just a happy coincidence?
No, what drew me to the area was that I came here, as the old story, I came here on the spur of the moment from Los Angeles to marry a French lady, and this was where she lived. In fact, she was brought up in this apartment because her mother was a professor at the Sorbonne, which is nearby, and we moved in. Very kindly, she lent it to us when we had our daughter, and we liked it, and she was fed up with walking up 6 flights of stairs, so we bought it from her, and then we put in a lift.
Right.
Thank heaven. We've been here ever since, and it's just our place now.
So, speaking of history that we touched on just briefly, I want to go to a comment from one of the readers already. It ties in nicely. My question, this is from Lida. She says, my question is, do you consider yourself something of a French historian, or do you do the research just prior to writing it?
A French historian. I wish I could aspire to that distinction. No, I'm an amateur historian, if anything. All the other countries I've lived in, I've never been that interested in the history. But the history of France, and particularly of Paris, is so interesting and so full of sort of almost movie-like people and incident that you can't help being involved in it. And you know, the great thing about Paris is that it's always preserved. People don't tear down buildings here. They keep this Paris is the Paris of 200 and 300 years ago. So you can't help feeling the history. And yeah, I pick up on it and I dig around and so on. This book, I didn't research the history of this book specifically. It happened to be something that was in my mind, and I thought this would be a good place to talk about it, because the book is about the seasons in Paris and the importance to the French of seasons, of events, of festivals, of celebrations. And of course the Revolution is one of the things they celebrate. And it's still, you know, the storming of the Bastille is still the national day and so on. You can't get away from history. Every day you go out and you live it. So I haven't studied it, but I've kind of absorbed it through the pores, I think.
I've got two questions on that. One is, and first I see there's 20 people watching us from around the world, which is, that means we've got a crowd of, what did I say, 720 right now.
Right.
That's a record.
Right.
But a question that wasn't on this that I was just thinking about, I think a lot about Paris, the mix of the old and the new. You know, like when you see an old boulangerie that's been turned into a modern fashion shop or whatever. What do you think about that?
Well, I love the fact that, as you say, there's a pharmacy up by the Panthéon, which is now a dress shop, but it still says pharmacy over the door. And of course, in the Marais, there are butcher shops that are boutiques and so on. By law, you must preserve the exterior of any building. We thought at one point of putting a plaque on the front of this building, not because I lived here, because Sylvia Beach lived here and it greeted people like Hemingway and Joyce. And the paperwork we would have had to fill in to do it. Oh, really? Incredible. As one of my neighbours said, oh, John, c'est un chronophage. I mean, it's a time eater, which is a very French concept.
That's a good phrase to know for France in general.
It is definitely, yeah.
Do you know, do they put those things at the front, the memorial things on the wall? Does the person have to be deceased to do that?
Oh yes, surely yes, and well deceased. It's like the Panthéon, you know. They bury you. They wait a century. They dig you up and put you in the Panthéon. Yeah. So it's the same with these plaques.
The Panthéon, which is mentioned in the book.
The Panthéon has got a central role in many ways.
Sort of pivotal.
Literally.
Yeah. Part of the book. But what was it that you hadn't? You were late to go in there, or?
Well, no. You probably know the Panthéon is this big thing that looks like a church up on the hill, and I thought it was a church. Looks like a church, smells like a church. It must be a church. But Marie-Dominique said, no, it's not a church at all. It's a sort of secular church, if you like. It's where the great of France are buried. It's an honour to be buried in the Panthéon. It's like being buried, if you're a soldier, to be buried in Arlington Cemetery. If you're a poet, to be buried in Westminster Abbey. Well, the sort of people who are buried in the Panthéon, Rousseau, Zola, and Jean Moulin, who was the leader of the Resistance during the war, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, etc., etc. What I didn't realise was that also in there is Foucault's pendulum, which is this bizarre thing which is attached to the very top of the dome with an enormously long cable at the bottom of which is this golden orb, and it ticks back and forth day and night every 10 seconds, but underneath it the floor turns because it's not attached, whereas the floor moves with the rotation of the earth. Of course, that's what it was put there for, to illustrate this. Well, I thought it had been invented by Umberto Eco, who used it in one of his books. And when I saw the real thing, I thought, what's that doing there? I thought this was just purely, one of his imaginative creations. But no, it really exists. And that's so French, because what he says, you see, is, he said, this is exactly how the French think of themselves. This pivot, this pendulum never stirs. The world moves, but it remains absolutely in the same place. That's exactly how the French think of themselves. They have got the idea. They know how to live. The rest of the world moves around. They are unmovable. And that's why people come here, because this is the perfect. They have achieved perfection.
Right.
That's the way they think.
And do you agree with that?
I wouldn't argue with it. I think they probably have a better claim than many countries, certainly to any I've lived in.
Do you like writing about the French? I mean, you write a lot about Paris as a place, but you also write a lot about the people.
I like writing about the French, not living French people so much as people of the past. I think in a way it's a bit rude to write about living people. This, in fact, is what Peter Mayle ran up against that in his Bonjour Provence and so on.
Right, that was the first book for this book club.
Right.
A Year in Provence.
Yeah,
and the people in the town weren't so...
No, in fact, that's why the book wasn't translated here for a long time, because the people were offended to be made to look like, figures of fun. And I can understand that. I write about my family and my wife. I figure they're fair game, but not the bulk of French people.
Do you think it was because he didn't think his book would be so successful?
Who, Mayle?
Yeah.
Oh no, I think he had every reason to believe it would be successful.
So he's in dangerous territory then.
It's a bit tricky, I don't like to. I don't mind people writing about me, but I'd rather avoid it, I suppose. But people in the street, people who run shops and everything, they don't expect to be the subject of books. On the other hand, down in Fouras, which is where we have a summer place, I wrote about the butcher there, and affectionately, but who was a real character. And ever since then, in the market, people hail me, "Oh, you're the Australian writer. You wrote about Monsieur so-and-so." So I've become a character down there. People don't mind that so much, I suppose, because I was sort of, I was admiring of him. Right. But Mayle's books are a bit, he pokes fun, which I don't think is good manners.
So I want to talk to you about, I see there's a lot of comments that have come through. I might whiz through a few of them, but also get back to the A Year in Paris after A Year in Provence, actually. But first, there's got hellos coming from Melbourne, Illinois, New York City. Corinne says, "Hi, John and Oliver." John in caps. Katie Miller, who is incidentally in this room, is also commenting, saying hello from Northern England. "I hope my internationally travelling wife isn't causing too much trouble." No question. You guys, a lot of people saying where they're from. But there's a question here from Brian Fitzgerald. He said, "John, what are your thoughts on Australia? Do you look through a different lens? And when was the last time that you were back in Australia?"
I was there about 4 years ago for the Sydney Writers' Festival, and it was a very good event. I was glad to be invited. We had fun. But I was surprised and saddened by how different Australia was. Sydney has become this really ugly town now with the high rises and everything. So I was sad to see that. On the other hand, there were some funny events. There's a writer named David Malouf who's quite well known, and he and I were invited to speak at a kind of satellite literary festival some miles outside Sydney, and the organisers asked us would we mind sharing a car when we went up. So we did, and while we were in the car we were catching up, and there was a good deal of gossip about various friends, and since David is gay, a lot of them were for people who were behaving badly and so on. Anyway, at the end of it, when we got out, the driver said, "I'd just like to say I do a lot of this driving, and that's the most interesting backseat conversation I've heard in years."
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Back to the book, and you guys watching at home. If you put your questions, I'll get back to them in about 5 minutes, and then we're going to have a look at, as promised, one of your sort of prized possessions in terms of your first edition books. But back to the book for a second. So a lot of people, I think, even in this book club, when they picked up the book A Year in Paris, thought it'd be about a year of your life here, one specific year. But it's not about that. And if you haven't read it at home, it's not about that. It's more a sort of mix of history and vignettes and stories and a whole mix of stuff. What prompted you to sort of write the book in that way?
Well, I've written other books about my life in Paris. I suppose Most Beautiful Walk in the World is very much like my year in Paris. The others I wrote about cooking and eating. Very often they are seasonal. I wrote one about Christmas in Paris, and so I've done a lot of that. I might have done it piecemeal, but you know, I have pretty well covered my life in Paris. And I may do another book, you know, like that as well. But what I wanted to do was deal with something a little wider and to do with my relationship with the French and the way the French perceive themselves and how I perceive them, how we as foreigners perceive them, and then dig a little into what's below the surface, because you know it's so easy for us. We come here, we go to the museums, we eat the food, we listen to the music, we go off, and how much do we really know about what happened under the surface? Really, most people don't have the time. So I wanted to do that to some extent.
I've got some more questions coming in that I want to just touch on here. That's not even a question. I had one question that's disappeared. Yeah, that's right. It's actually from Catherine, who's in this room, but she sent it in earlier. I'm going to read it now. You have. They want to know how. Catherine wants to know how much time you spend reading, right? It seems like you've read everything in capital letters, and that you have an amazing capacity to remember this stuff, which I know you've got like a.
Well, I'm very lucky with my memory. Yes, I don't know why. It doesn't run in the family.
Right.
My wife sometimes forgets who I am, but no. An enormous amount of completely worthless information is stuck in my brain. Yeah, I read a lot. Yes, I have read a lot. Solitary people do. You know, for a long time I lived by myself, and I lived in foreign countries by myself. So you read a lot. You do a book a day at least.
Really? Hang on, do you read? So when you're reading a book as an author, are you sort of reading it every single word, skim reading it? You sort of get the gist.
No, I don't skim read. The other thing I skim read is when I'm researching something and I'm reading a text, not a textbook, but a biography or something. I won't read it all because I'm looking for particular facts or some person. But if you're talking about fiction or serious memoir, no, of course I read it.
What do you think about skim reading though? If someone told
I can't do it.
What if someone told you they skim read your book? Would you be offended? Or?
Oh, I wouldn't mind as long as they read it, as long as they bought it.
Another question from a regular contributor. Another thing I want to say that I think has been great about this book club is people have been getting into. I saw one comment from Mary. I can't remember her last name, but she, after your haiku chapter, she put in a haiku in the group, and other people were putting haikus.
Oh, great! Because the little epigraph of the chapter is a haiku I wrote. In fact, I don't say that, but that's the little.
That's funny because that brings me to another question I was going to ask you about if you put any little secrets in the book that only you know.
No, just things like that. You know, No, I don't. They're not secrets. Just things I don't necessarily explain.
Right. The other thing I want to say is that I think it was Mary as well. When she finished reading the book. At the start of all your chapters, you have the little sort of two
epigraph.
or three. She did her own one based on her own life. I think she's watching right now, just describing how she read the book and what she thought of it and what the temperature was, where she was.
Yeah.
Which I love you guys watching at home when you do that kind of stuff. But a question from Cindy Owens, who's a regular commenter and reader, and she said, "What went into the decisions related to the sequencing of the chapters?"
Yes, it's tricky. That's one of the things that gave me greatest trouble. I wanted to make it sequential, covering a whole year, but of course I had to deal with the historical sections. So I tried to alternate. You know, one chapter to do with the kind of the month, the specific month. Then the next one would be something more general and historical, or like the haiku chapter, something that seemed to somehow relevant to the subject, something that really happened, but it wasn't directly connected, but it just seemed to fit, which I think it did. And like the story of you and the alligators, you know, and that sort of thing. Again, it didn't particularly relate, but I thought it was interesting thing to put in, but people seem to think so as well.
I think that was, from me personally, I think it was brilliant. I've never seen my name in a book before. I was so
First
thrilled.
of many, I'm sure.
Oh, I hope so. But that was cool. But how? That's another thing. I kind of asked you this already, but not for this. Is how you go about in your books. In all your books, you meet so many people and you get these interesting stories out of them. If you could give a tip to someone watching, how to be so open to get these stories out of people, what's your secret?
Oh, well, that's difficult, isn't it?
I know it's a difficult question, but there must be an answer.
No, there isn't any one answer. People trust you or they don't. You know, some people are just, you don't trust them. They're untrustworthy. Other people will talk to you. I don't know. There's a play called "A Day in the Death of Joe Egg" about a couple who have a child who's like a sort of vegetable, you know, and at one point the wife sits on the stage and talks to the audience and tries to explain what it's like, and then she looks around. She said, "I don't know why I'm telling you a lot of strangers," and that always resonated with me, because I think there are some people who open up and talk. And then they kind of say, oh, why am I telling you this? You know, and I suppose you've seen Sex, Lies and Videotape.
Yep.
That's the same thing. The guy goes around interviewing women about their sex lives. And so they talked to him, and he said, oh, yes. He said, some of the tapes are like 3 minutes. One lasted 4 days. And yes, some people are just... people will talk to you, or they won't. I don't think it's a technique. I think it's... I don't know what, something, a vibration or something around.
I realise that time is slipping away quickly, so we might have to get through these next bits quickly, because we also want to show the book that you got there. But I wanted to ask, if you had to leave Paris, France, what would be the thing that, let's say you had to go back to America or Australia, what do you think you'd miss most about living in France?
I suppose what would I miss? What would I miss? I suppose the sense of family, not just my own family, but the sense of everyone has family here. You know, my family is scattered all over the place, and we never were all that close. But family here is a living, you know, vital concept. Everybody has a family here. Everybody, and that family is attached to a particular piece of land and particular way of doing things and saying things and particular rituals and this sort of thing. That I would miss, that sense of belonging, because up until now I never did belong, but I feel I belong here. If that's an answer.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I think I have to ask, because sort of the last question about the book related here is a lot of talk of the seasons. We didn't even get into the whole the calendar.
No.
But I mean, that's all right. Everyone's read the book already.
Right.
But in terms of seasons and your favourite in Paris?
Oh, it would probably be Brumaire, which is the month of fog, so it's sort of October, November.
And why?
Well, when you're here and the mist is up on the river and you walk down to the Seine and, you know, you see the mist and the sun coming through, it's magical. There's nowhere like that. Also, it's the time when Paris comes back to life after the holidays. That's when there's all the great music. To go out to the Philharmonie out in the Cité de la Musique and hear Barbara Hannigan sing, that's just... There is nothing greater than that sense of walking through the dark and the cold to this extraordinary building, knowing that you're going to have an extraordinary emotional and artistic experience. I've never had that before. That's one of the great glories of Paris. Everything is integrated, you know, it's all part of the way of life.
Great answer. I love it. And if you liked an answer like that and you haven't read John's book, it's A Year in Paris. That's it right there. I see the comments are coming through, but we'll go and answer those ones later. What we can finish on, I thought, is showing one of your books that you got off the shelf.
Here's one. Here's one I made earlier.
Telling the story of it.
Well, this is one of the rarest books in the world, in that there's probably only about 20 copies that exist in anything like this form. This is the first edition of The Great Gatsby. The first edition of what they call the first state, meaning before the corrections were made for the second printing. And this is the dust wrapper, which somebody has said is the most valuable single piece of paper in 20th century literature, because most people threw these away. They hardly ever survive in anything like good condition, and certainly not in a condition like this. And as you probably know, Fitzgerald saw the design for the cover in Scribner's office, and he said, "I want that for my book." And Max Perkins, his editor, said, "But you haven't written the book yet." He said, "It doesn't matter. I will make sure those things are in the book." And of course, the eyes are the eyes on the billboard of Dr. Mecklenburg, the oculist, you know, and this is the city, and this is Daisy, and so on. But it's one of the most perfect covers of any book, and this is uncommon. So if you'd like to buy it, I can sell to you for 100,000.
For how much?
100,000.
100,000.
Yes. That's the friendship price.
Yeah. I'll keep that one in mind. But thanks for showing that, and everyone in the room. I think we can have a good look at that later. In fact, maybe we can show it a little closer to the camera too. If I can, may I hold it?
Sure.
Oh, I'm nervous. That's just for you guys at home if you can see it. First edition, Great Gatsby. But I'll put that back down here. But you've been John Baxter from A Year in Paris, and you guys watching at home, I hope that you buy the book and read it. If not, put your questions and I might still get a chance to ask them to John. But thanks for being on the show.
Always a pleasure.
And thanks for being in the crowd, everybody.
Thank you.